Bound for Oregon, Chapter 15. It rose up in front of us, the highest, grandest mountain that I had ever seen, cone-shaped and fringed at the bottom with dark evergreens and shimmery gold leaves of autumn. It changed to bare gray rock as you looked up toward the peak, and at the very top, almost covered by little puffs of cloud, was a white cap of snow. "That is Mount Hood," Father told us. We would not have to cross over it, he said, only go around its side on a trail called the Barlow Road. To me, it seemed too hard a task. Our oxen were just bones covered by too large skin, with hardly a spark of life left in them. Rover limped or walked on 3 legs most of the time. The wagon cover, once so white that it had dazzled my eyes, now was a brownish gray, torn and mud-stained. As for us, our clothes were patched and worn through. If it hadn't been for Mother's motto of "a stitch in time saves 9," we would all have been in rags and walking barefoot like so many others we saw. My blue flower-sprigged dress had been mended so many times it looked like patchwork, and the flowers had completely faded away. The wood splints showed through our threadbare sunbonnets. My shoes were almost out of the toes, and Father and John's breeches had patches on top of patches. Most of all, we were just so weary of traveling, but it had to be done. Wash the dishes, pack up the kettle and the frying pan, shake out the bedding, roll it up, and stow it inside the wagon. Hitch up the team, crack the whip, listen to the wagon wheels creak as if complaining, then slowly start to turn. Another day on the endless trail. It was all I could remember, all I knew how to do. Over hills and hollows we crept along, always in the shadow of that great mountain. There were more streams to cross and another river. This one, a branch of the Deschutes, was not as very wide, but deep and swift. The oxen refused to go into it. Never, even back in Kansas, had they seen water as fast-moving as this. The animals would start up, but as soon as they reached the rushing water, they stopped abruptly. The poor things couldn't get the courage to make the plunge. "Hoo-way! Hoo-way!" shouted Father. He coaxed and goaded and finally in frustration gave them the whip, but nothing worked. They couldn't seem to overcome the fear. Just downstream was a little ferry boat. "You and the children will have to cross by ferry with the wagon," Father told Mother, his face grim but determined. "John and I are going to make these oxen swim." Father paid 2 Indians $1 to take us across. The wagon was unhitched and rolled onto a flatboat, and we floated easily to the other side. Then, as Leeuwen and I stood watching on the bank, Father and John again tried to force the stubborn oxen into the water. It was a long, hard struggle, but at last they managed to get them swimming, and soon we were all on the other side of the river. We were now in the Cascade Mountains. Like the blues before them, these were rocky, and in places even steeper and higher. The trees were giant pines and cedars and firs, so tall that it hurt my neck to try to see the tops of them, and so close together that they blocked out the sun. The road was rough and hard to follow. Up and down it went, over sharp rocks, through mud holes, twisting and turning, around stumps and tree roots and fallen logs. "This must be the worst road ever devised," sighed Mother, after we had been struggling for hours and getting nowhere. The oxen strained and pulled with all their waning strength. The wagon lurched and bounced. In the worst places, we had to get out and walk, Mother and Leeuwen holding Cynthia by the hand and carrying little Elijah. Through the paper-thin soles of my shoes, I could feel every stone that I stepped on. But I didn't think of my sore feet. I held the warm, sleeping baby close to my chest, feeling proud that Mother trusted me to carry him, and I made sure that I did not stumble. On the 3rd day, we came to a place called Laurel Hill. "Whoa!" called Father to the oxen. As they creaked to a stop, he walked ahead to look it over. I stood next to him, looking down, unable to believe that the road really went over this steep drop. It was almost perpendicular and about 1/2 mile long, narrow and winding, rocky and muddy and slippery. It reminded me of a tall, crooked chimney. "What are we going to do?" I asked Father anxiously. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked around, examining the nearby rocks and trees, testing the slippery slope. "Others have done it," he said finally, "and so will we. Do you see the bark rubbed off the large trees here at the top? Some have changed their wagons to a tree, then let out the chain little by little. Others probably cut down small trees and tied them on and back to break their descent, or piled rocks in front of the wagon wheels." After thinking it over a while, Father decided not only to use chains, but to drag a small tree besides. First, he unhitched all of the oxen except Buck and Ben. The other animals would be led down the hill later. He had John cut down a little tree with many branches and tie it at the back of the wagon. Then he attached a train to the rear axle and wrapped the other end around a strong standing tree at the top of the hill. He set the wagon brake on the last notch. Mother sat watching on a tree stump, Elijah in her arms, the rest of us nearby. "Gee, Buck," ordered Father. "Gee, Ben." Very slowly they started down the hill. The locked wheels made a dismal screeching sound that echoed through the mountains. From up above, Father let out the chain a little bit at a time. John walked alongside Buck, one hand gripping his horn, holding him back. The oxen slid from side to side, pushed by the tongue of the wagon. In spite of Father and John's efforts, I could see them beginning to pick up speed. "Oh, no," Mother cried softly. The wagon, clattering behind them, shoved the oxen along. Faster and faster they went. I took a deep breath and forgot to let it out, watching helplessly. John was still clinging to Buck's horn, but he couldn't hold him back any longer. His hat went flying off. His feet skidded over the muddy ground. He was going to be trampled. "Jump," I thought. As if he heard me, John finally gave up and leaped out of the way. As they neared the bottom of the hill, the oxen were going at full gallop. It looked like the wagon would run right over them. I waited for the crash, the sickening splintering of the wood, the overturned broken wagon that would be the final disaster. Then, miraculously, they were down. John came sliding along behind the wagon, picking up his hat and dusting off his breeches. "Hurrah for our team!" he shouted, his long, piercing voice. "Thank goodness," breathed Mother, and Cynthia clapped her hands, laughing. Another obstacle had been overcome. But sometime during that night, while we were sleeping, poor old Buck died. The next morning, we all gathered around his body, looking down in sorrow. "I don't know what happened," Father said, sadly shaking his head. "Maybe he was injured somehow coming down Laurel Hill. Or maybe," I thought, "he had finally just worn out after bringing us so far." And I was glad he had gotten away with that bread dough back in the Blue Mountains. Father hitched up Bright in Buck's place and put a cow that Mrs. McReynolds had left us in Bright's place, and we went on again. All along our way through the mountains, we kept seeing abandoned wagons and yokes and chains, as well as dead oxen and mules. It looked as if many families had been forced to travel the last miles of their journey on foot. One morning, just as we were starting out, we came along upon 3 good wagons standing deserted at the side of the trail. Father stopped our wagon and went to look inside. Most of the contents were still there. I saw trunks of clothes, pots, dishes, all sorts of useful things. "Take anything you need," Father said to Mother. "Oh, no," she objected. "I couldn't do that. It wouldn't be right." Father put his hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Angelina," he insisted gently. "The owners will not be coming back. The only ones to benefit will be the Indians, and they will take what they want and likely burn the rest." Mother's face looked torn, but finally she mustered up the courage to take a few things that we really needed: a warm coat for Father, a flat iron, a coffee pot, a camp kettle, a washboard to replace the one that Polly had kicked to pieces, and a pretty brass candlestick. Later that day, just as Father had predicted, we saw a band of Indians heading in the direction of the wagons. "Oh dear," sighed Mother with a regretful little smile. "I guess we should have taken more." On we went through the mountains, crossing and recrossing yet another river, sloshing through icy streams, climbing up and down steep and muddy hills. It was cold, the kind of damp cold that pierced through my clothing to chill me down to the bones. But we had no snow. Most days the weather was drizzly and rainy. Luckily, we had all the wood around us now, so that we could have a good warm fire in the evening. On the 10th day, after we had left the dolls, at about noon, I was walking next to the wagon, gazing down at my shoes and wondering how long it would be before my toes poked all the way through. I looked up, and suddenly, through the tall trees ahead, I caught a glimpse of what seemed to be a wide open valley. I blinked. Was this some sort of vision? I wondered, could it be real? Looking again, I saw the valley was grassy and sprinkled with spreading oak trees and fringed round the edges with blue-green firs that seemed to reach out into the mountains, into the blue sky above. Yes, I thought, this was the organ we had been hoping to find. Father had seen it too. He halted the team. Coming back to the wagon, he looked up at Mother sitting on the spring seat. "Praise the Lord," he said. "We made it through at last." A great weight seemed to have lifted off his shoulders, and he was smiling the way he used to back home. Mother stared ahead, her face perfectly still, her eyes bright. I saw her mouth move, but no words came out. "Oh, good," said Leeuwen, smiling happily. "Now we can play in our yard and go to meeting." Just then John came riding up with the cattle. Seeing us, he stopped, looking to see what was wrong. Then he too gazed over the beautiful valley below. "Hip, hip, hurrah for Oregon!" he shouted, and he tossed his hat so high in the air I didn't see it come down. Cynthia was looking at him with a puzzled expression on her face. "What is Oregon?" she asked, and we all laughed with joy. We all came down out of the mountains into that valley and found farms and food. Father bought a few vegetables, and I was once again able to taste something green. In 4 more days, we made our way to a place called Howell's Prairie, where the land was flat and ringed with mountains, and the soil looked rich. Here we made camp. It was October 16th, and we had been on our way for more than 6 long months. That evening, sitting in the warm, close circle around the campfire, Father read to us a psalm of thanksgiving, Psalm 107. "Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good," it began, and the psalm went on to tell how the Lord delivered his people out of the wilderness and saved the hungry and thirsty who cried out to him. Later, Father came to the verse that said, "So he bringeth them unto their desired haven." It seemed to me that those words had been written just for us. After he finished reading, Father closed the Bible, and for a moment everyone was silent. Then he turned to Mother, his face in the firelight, looking younger than it had in a long time. "Can you tell us what you are most thankful for?" he asked. Mother's answer came quickly, her voice quiet and sober. "I am thankful that we all got through alive." Father nodded, smiling. Then he looked across at me. "And you, Mary Ellen?" There were so many things, I thought, staring into the little red licking flames, but one stood out in my mind. "I am thankful that you were not sick very long," I said, "and John was never sick at all." "I am thankful that Blackie gave us milk all the way through," piped up Leeuwen. "I am thankful that I got to come with you," added John. Father looked down at Cynthia, leaning sleepily on his knee. "And what about you, little mite?" he asked. "What are you thankful for?" "Yijah," said Cynthia, and after that we all bowed our heads, and Father said a prayer, thanking God for delivering us from the wilderness and bringing us to this beautiful land of promise.